of the Urban Flood Safety and Water Quality District to order. It's 1:02. So welcome. Thanks for joining us. And Wendy, you want to do roll call?
I will. We are just continuing to let people in, and starting with Nancy Hendrickson.
I am here.
Steve Fancher.
Here.
Eric Mueller.
Here.
Dave Ritma.
Here.
Seth Reeser. No. Ashton Simpson.
Present.
And I was told Lori Stegman will join us in about a half an hour.
Commissioner Stegman will actually not be able to join us today. I'm sorry.
Okay, that's noted. Thank you. Emerald Bogue.
Here.
Corky Collier.
Here.
Rochelle Altman.
Here.
Mary Helen Kincaid.
Here.
Tanny Stephenson. Let's see, Tanny. Eric Molander.
Here.
Brent Cartwright.
Here.
Ed Washington said he was not able to join. Bob Salinger. Heather King.
Here.
And we have 12 board members present, unless Seth joined us when I wasn't looking. Okay.
Thanks, Wendy. And welcome to November. How did that happen? Wow. Hope you all didn't eat too much candy last night. Let's see here. So we're going to jump right into it. Let's get to our agenda. And first off, we have Noah. Noah's going to be presenting polling results, polling and survey results. Noah, are you ready to go?
Yeah, I'm gonna make a
Jim,
few
did you want
remarks.
to say anything before we get started?
Yeah, I'll make a few remarks and then hand it over to Noah.
Okay, thanks, Carrie.
Sure. So Carrie Sandeman, Planning Department Manager and GeoBond Project Manager. So you will hear today the results of the polling, focus group, business engagement, community engagement work that our staff and consulting team have been working on for a long time. And I just want to reflect that this is a key milestone for this work that we've been doing for nearly the last year. And that the information that you're going to hear today was designed with the specific intention of helping to inform the decisions that you have coming up. And that in designing that, you all were instrumental in forming the community education and engagement work group, participating in that committee for some of you, providing feedback on priorities for polling and focus groups, and just in all the questions that you've asked along the way about who we're able to reach out to, the temperature of the business community, those kinds of things. So we thank you for that. And we think that you'll find that this information does a really good job of helping us understand what the public cares about, what they're willing and interested in having us provide for them and pay for, and how to communicate with them. And we have just a truly expert team of support that we've been lucky to work with over the last many months. Noah Siegel from MSH Strategies, Miranda Everett from FM3, thank you, Irene Kim from Cascadia Partners, and Jake Weigler from Praxis Political. And so just really glad to have all of them in the room here today. And so I hope that you're able to ask the questions that you need and come away with that clear understanding of what the public values and is interested in. And I was going to hand it over to Noah, but now I see Wendy has her hand up. So maybe we'll do that first.
I just also wanted to acknowledge that we have Hugh Harris and Cassie Cohen here from the work group, and they're able to join this meeting.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for participating on the work group. Okay, Noah, to you.
That's great. I love it when I see people from old work. Hi, Cassie. Good to see you. I want to just echo what Carrie was saying, that as a consultant, it's just been a real pleasure working with this team. I wish all projects were as smooth and integrated as this, and I'm really pleased to bring you an integrated presentation of all of our findings from the hard work that we've been updating you about, that's been going on. Really comes together nicely. The goal being to present you with as much 360 information as we can from the community you're serving to make decisions specifically about the bond measure. So Carrie's going to put up the presentation. She already outlined all of us. And I will just say that I'm going to keep my words as short as possible. We're aiming to keep this under half an hour. That's a message also to all of my friends on the consulting team, so that we can spend the good chunk of the time letting you ask questions and dive deeper into things that are of interest to you. So let's get going. Want to
Are
jump
you
on?
able to, are you able to see?
Yeah, we can see, so we can move forward. I won't belabor this point. You've seen the slide of, as we've moved along, but I really like to-do lists, and this just shows that we are moving through our strategy pretty efficiently and on time. And we've been pulling together the draft investment options for the public to consider, and then seeing how those perform in polling, engagement, conversations. And the idea is to bring that all to you today, to look at, to ask questions as you move towards finalizing a ballot measure referral. And this just, in a Gantt chart form, we're in this October-December phase, where a reminder that we're looking to refer in December for the May election is our target. So we're going to present to you the integrated research findings. We'll take turns from our groups, sharing what we've done and what we found. Actually, it's in the wrong order here, but we'll start with a debrief on the polling and focus groups, go into public engagement and the survey, talk about the business outreach that Praxis has been doing, and then I'll round it out with our shared consultant recommendations to you for your consideration, and to MCDD and our clients as well. So I'm not going to bury the lead. I just wanted to share my 3 key takeaways from all of the combined work, and you'll see this reflected as we go through the details of how we got to these findings. But I did want to just share right away that this is now our 2nd round of polling, and we do see a clear path to success for passing a bond measure for flood safety. We see a strong emphasis on the need to focus on preservation and protection, both of neighborhoods, communities, businesses, as well as protecting nature, the environment, fish and wildlife. This is where people's mindset is at right now. Protecting what we have, not doing things that are too dramatically expansive or innovative right now. And we'll talk more about why that is. And then finally, that there is a sweet spot in terms of the dollar amount for the bond measure that would have the lowest amount of risk and the highest amount of benefit. And we can talk about what that is as we go through the polling, but that's very helpful to know, I think, as you're going through your decision-making process. So I will hand it over to Miranda from FM3 to go through the polling.
Thanks, Noah. I'm Miranda Everett. I'm a senior vice president at FM3. We do lots of work in the region, including 2 rounds so far of surveys and some focus groups with you folks here on this project. I'm going to talk a little bit about a survey we conducted recently at the end of September, and then a little bit about a focus group we did just after that to add some depth and texture to what we found in the survey results. This was the result of a survey of 549 voters within the district, likely May turnout model that gives us a margin of error around 4.4% for the full sample, and places where you see a half sample, it's around 6%. And this was using our typical dual mode approach, which contacts people by text message, landline, and cell phone, just about every way we know how. So on the next slide, you will see the big picture here, and I think Noah already spoke to the upshot here, which is that we have something that does look viable, but it's not sort of a set it and forget it scenario. The support here is very broad, 62% yes for the benefits version of the caption we tested, 57% support for the investments version of the caption we tested, but they are quite soft. The definitely yes proportions for each are fewer than 1 in 5. You can see lots of folks are kind of with us, but very tentatively. And so our job in the rest of the poll was to identify whether it's possible to really solidify support with some messaging we can deliver. One key slide on the next slide, one key note is about some demographics. We see, some sort of typical demographic differences here where younger voters are more supportive and women are marginally more supportive than men. But again, even among some folks who typically make up the base for revenue measure investments like this one, that support is very soft. So that's kind of a key finding across that demographic, and it's mirrored across a lot of other demographics we looked at as well. The next slide tells us a little bit about why we think that might be. Perhaps no surprise that folks in the region are feeling kind of pessimistic, and there are a couple different headwinds that we face. The key one at the top there being waste and inefficiency in local government, considered an extremely or very serious problem by 71%. 69% said the same of climate change, so sort of in a similar tier. Some other things we didn't even include on the list because we knew they'd be a lot higher, like homelessness, cost of housing, things like that. But we can see at the very bottom of the list, by contrast, are some of the key issues we're talking and thinking about, including flooding from either the Columbia or the Willamette, severe rainstorms, extreme weather events. Those things are just not top of mind for folks, especially compared to their sort of sense of unease with local government. On the next slide, you'll see we asked supporters of either of the ballot labels we tested why they would vote yes. Lots of folks, 22%, said something about maintaining or improving infrastructure. They're very focused on the kind of nuts and bolts in what they read. Water quality is also a key theme, as well as flood protection. And then a smattering of other responses about protecting communities of color, protecting wildlife, safety issues, things like that. I think the key takeaway here is that to the extent that from the ballot title itself, people are kind of getting information that drives support, it's really related to that need they see to upgrade infrastructure. On the next slide, you can see, as we said, we wanted to look not just at that initial vote because we saw that that was 60 to 31, but kind of soft. How much do we grow support as we add more information and context for folks? So the after information thing in the middle here, this is after we give a little bit of plain language that kind of mirrors what they might see sort of in a newspaper or in kind of a pretty straightforward and not too argumentative approach there. 62% support, so essentially no change in the breadth of support, but that intensity does tick up to 25%. And then after some positive messages we're able to deliver, 2/3 are in favor, 35% in the definitely yes column. So to be able to move that intensity up with an investment in a little bit of communications is part of what's kind of underlying that recommendation we have, or that belief we have that this could be viable in the spring. So the next few slides really dig into some of the priorities, as Noah mentioned, and then I'll talk about messaging a little bit more. So top of the list, this will look familiar to folks' open-ended responses. What do they value about what we could be investing in? Top of the list is water quality. To any measure I work on anywhere across the country, parks, recreation, anything that has to do with water, that is at the very top of the list. People really just strongly believe that if we don't have good quality water, then nothing else really matters. And so talking about that is really key. You can see 40% and more giving that the very highest rating of support there. We also see on this slide everything that 3 and 5 or more call extremely or very important to them. So that includes upgrading infrastructure to conserve energy and reduce long-term maintenance costs. Again, getting to that priority they named themselves having to do with the infrastructure, as well as repairing aging pumps, pipes, and drains, backup power, protecting homes and businesses from flooding, and preparing for climate change, which we saw was a fairly broadly shared concern. So those are the things that are really valued by voters and really connecting with them. Moving down the list a bit more on the next slide, you will see things that 3 and 5 or fewer said that were extremely or very important to them. At the top is about floodplains that provide fish and wildlife habitat. That's something folks value. It's in sort of a second tier, protecting PDX from flooding. Majority is also valuing that. And then things near the bottom of the list, there is things that are more kind of about the mechanism or about the details, like a high cost of insurance kind of impacting homeowners and business owners, about federal standards for flood control. I think we found a lot out in the focus groups about how that's not something the average person knows too much about, and is not super motivating unless we put it in the right context. So you can see here sort of the general ranking of things, and where there was a lot of intensity was that first slide, and these are sort of a middle to lower tier in terms of investments people are excited about. On the next slide, you can see the reactions to different message themes. So here we just have the kind of shorthand we used for each. In the poll itself, people had 2 or 3 sentences behind each of these on these themes. And we really wanted to assess the differences between different themes. We've kind of created a few chunks of places where messages are most convincing. So that dark blue, 40% and higher is sort of a rule of thumb for something highly persuasive. For us in this survey, we've got a couple different themes that meet that benchmark. Aging, which is talking about, parts of our system are over 100 years old. This makes basic maintenance that brings us up to modern standards. Just letting people know the current condition. That's very powerful. Prevention, this is a simple message saying cleaning up after is very expensive. Let's prevent it first. Folks get that. And then pollution, the extent to which we can prevent pollution from a major flood is something that when we bring it up is pretty powerful for folks, because it really does connect to the value they place to water quality. In the second tier, we have a set that has to do with nature. So that's nature-based solutions. When we sort of explain that in a kind of plain language term, then people really get it and it resonates. Kind of like the idea of protecting risk of flooding and getting these nice things for fish and wildlife and open space. That feels really nice for folks. Matching funds is important. And then the business impacts message, which kind of helped people realize that so much of the supply chain is located in the floodplain. And then in sort of a lower tier, we have things that are a little less broadly persuasive for folks. Focus on equity, focus on climate, the idea that this is kind of a simple thing to do. It can be completed on time and on budget because we know how to do it. It's not too complicated. We don't have to do extra studies really. Those are sort of in a middle tier, and at the very bottom was a message that dealt very specifically with cultural history, which folks I think told us is very nice to have, but is not a major motivation for voting yes on a tax measure. So on the next slide, we wanted to boil this down a little bit more. We gave people 5 different categories of sort of messages and said, which is the best reason to support this? And there's one kind of clear winner here. 29% said repairing aging flood control infrastructure. So again, infrastructure and repair is at the top of the list. And then the next 3 are all kind of in a similar tier, a mix of climate change preparation, preventing damage to water quality and wildlife, protecting homes and communities. And the very bottom is the economic impact. That's something that the average voter just is unlikely to rank in their sort of top tier. And notably, that very top row is going to serve all those other goals. And I think that is often the kind of frame that voters bring to that as well. So the final question in the poll series that we'll present today is about the price tag. So we did test 2 different amounts in our description. We had 175 million and 225 million, and we also boiled that down to sort of a household figure to help people kind of wrap their brains around what it means for them. We see 65% support when we do 175 million and only 60% support for 225. That, reference to where it grows or remains static is compared to that initial ballot label, where we had started around 3 and 5. So we see a little bit more growth in intensity and breadth at that lower price point. So there's a little bit of cost sensitivity there. So the next portion I'll cover here is about our focus groups. So these were held about 3 weeks ago now in Portland. We recruited folks to sort of generally match the demographics of the district. divided them by gender just for some group dynamic things there, and had, you know, wide-ranging discussions about these issues, showed them some materials and things like that. The next slide just has the brief caution we always have to add for any kind of focus group research, which is simply that this doesn't directly measure the frequency of opinions. It just helps us understand some of the results in the survey. So no statistical precision here, but lots of helpful insights. Next slide really adds some color to what I had mentioned earlier about trust in government and the local mood. It's very negative. Folks range from angry to hopeless when they think about things in the region. They're very focused on the problems of downtown Portland and how that reflects on the region. And increasingly, economic anxiety is at the fore. Cost of living is absolutely key, and cost of housing is a huge driver of that concern. And then a little bit of concern as well for folks about small businesses leaving the area and what that can mean for the broader economy. This context really has a lot of people just kind of at the very beginning of our discussion feeling uneasy, feeling that they have a general sense that government can't handle a lot of the challenges that the region is facing. So that is something for us to really be considering as we talk about a revenue measure. We also showed on the next slide these respondents' potential ballot title. And as we saw in the poll, reactions were pretty similar. Folks were overwhelmingly pretty supportive, but pretty soft. They had a lot of questions. Why aren't we meeting federal standards? And if we're not, why don't the feds pay for it? Who is paying for it? And how much is that going to cost me? Is flooding a real threat here? They had a lot of questions, and I think that really shows and sort of reinforces what we saw in the survey, that we're going to have to add some information for folks to help them kind of understand what the need is and really get their brains around the amount of money we're talking about here. In the focus groups, you know, people were throwing out $200, $100. And when we said, maybe it's something around 30, most felt pretty comfortable with that. And then when we talked about the ballot title itself and kind of what's in that, just a sort of rough approximation by gender, we saw a women's group was focused more on sort of those broader benefits, and the men's group was really attracted to the infrastructure upgrades, the kind of physical things that they could picture and see. On the next slide, we also wanted to dig into the complexities of talking about additional operating costs and sort of the fairness of the mechanism and how to pay for it. We drew their attention to the possibility of additional operating costs. So that's not something that necessarily would happen with a ballot measure, but we wanted to have that discussion. Didn't feel like a deal breaker. A lot of people admitted that they don't closely scrutinize all those bills and utilities. They feel like there's not much they can do about it. They have the general sense that things just kind of get more expensive over time. And if the amount is reasonable, then they're fine with it. Benefits beyond the managed floodplain, we asked them, you know, do you feel like it's fair to have to pay if you're not within that, you know, very specific region? People said, yeah, it's fine. They see clear benefits to being a citizen of the community. The drinking water impacts concern them, the harms to the airport and to shipping, they could pretty clearly see. And then just the broader impacts that could happen if a natural disaster, of people having to relocate, or what it means for sort of the regional disruption. So they felt like it makes sense for everybody to sort of chip in. And on the next few slides, we talk a little bit about messaging. So here we provided folks a little bit revised versions of some of the messages we tested in the poll to see how they react. Here, the business impact piece really was more of a standout. This kind of made the case that the supply chains kind of located here, the scale of the impact, preventing critical interruptions of the flow of goods. So this sort of framing did better than in the poll, especially in the men's group. The matching funds, that was something appealing. It helped people kind of understand the why now question that a lot of them had. Equity also was a bit more of a standout here. I think this message made a better case because it kind of connected the dots a bit more in terms of who is disproportionately impacted by some of these natural disasters and who is disproportionately going to have some trouble recovering, and the way that we can really make that happen differently this time if it has to happen. Pollution, also a key theme, as we saw in the poll. And on the next slide, you can see a couple more that were fairly resonant, including, again, that aging message, again, telling people that's 100 years old, we're going to bring it up to modern standards. A climate message in the focus groups did well. People kind of understood there a little bit better the mechanism that could create flooding once we sort of brought them along that chain of reasoning. It's not top of mind, but we got them there with the discussion. So I think that helped them react to this a little more strongly. And then again, that nature-based solutions and disaster prevention message also selected a couple times in the groups. So stepping back a little bit, key findings from the focus groups messaging, we saw that business impact message really stood out, particularly with the men. I think when we drew out that supply chain impact piece, it resonated, especially as a lot of people remember very recently not being able to find toilet paper or whatever it might be from the pandemic. They kind of understand that just a little bit more than they used to. Matching funds, again, that was a good message. It helped them understand why now, why if we've been out of date for so long is now the time. The equity message, this was powerful in the focus groups because people there were really, you know, they got it. They felt like, of course, Vanport was a majority Black community, and let's not do that again. Let's make sure that folks who are more vulnerable are protected, and let's make sure that they don't have to bear the burdens of cleaning up. And then water pollution, of course, resonated. It really helped people picture the stakes here, make it personal to them, and really connects to that deep concern that everyone has about water quality. So as a really quick overview, happy to take questions or pass it on to the next speaker.
Miranda, I would like to just keep cruising through. It's a totally unreasonable request to our experts in so many fields to sum it up so quickly, but it's such good work. Let's keep going. And Irene, let's talk about the work that you did on engagement and through this survey.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name's Irene Kim. I'm with Cascadia Partners. We are the consulting firm that has been focusing on culturally specific engagement and also led this kind of more general public survey. So I'll just provide some highlights here and share some of the results that we received through this public survey. So we received a total of 650 survey responses, which exceeded our target of 500. Unlike the polling, the survey is not statistically significant. So, and the real goal and purpose behind the survey was, one, to use as an engagement tool to raise awareness about flood safe Columbia River and the GeoBond. And two, was to really kind of get a temperature check on people's willingness to pay, kind of their general thoughts about the bond measure, and sort of kind of have a gut check about how people feel about this. Not everyone filled out the demographic questions, but the demographics of those who did respond are representative of the county's demographics. We worked with community engagement liaisons to also get participation from BIPOC and limited English speaking communities. So I think about 30% of the responses were from BIPOC communities and limited English. Overall, there was really broad support for all the scenarios, but support went down as the cost to the taxpayer went up, particularly for lower income groups. And then just based on just general comments in the surveys, there were lots of comments and questions about who should be paying and how much. There was a lot of interest in nature-based solutions. And another key takeaway from our outreach efforts and the survey comments is that I think it showed that there was more general education and outreach about the flood district and flood safety that was needed. So there are lots of questions around that. Next slide. This is kind of a geographic snapshot of who we heard from. So the majority of participants live in the managed floodplain, which was great to get that turnout. Next slide. And we asked about their level of support for the three different scenarios at 175, 200, and 250. So as I mentioned before, there's broad support for all three scenarios, but there was stronger support for this first scenario, where 67% of respondents supported the baseline flood safety option. And if you go to the next slide, there was a little less support for the scenario 2. And we also disclosed kind of what how much they would be paying for a year for the median household. And then again, similarly in scenario 3, about 60% of respondents supported the comprehensive flood safety scenario. And then in our last final slide here, we also asked folks to rank kind of different elements of what's most important to them as it relates to flood safety. And the key takeaway here is that addressing long-term as well as immediate concerns was ranked the highest among all the participants. And then limiting the cost to taxpayers was ranked the lowest. So that's kind of just an interesting note there. And then, yeah, I'll pass it on to Jake.
Hey everybody, my name is Jake Wagler. I'm with Praxis Political, and we're doing a variety of roles on this project, but we got to do business outreach. And I'll say, just as a starting point, really have gotten a lot of positive feedback from the business community about being proactive in this outreach. I'll say, it's a little unusual for a bonding and a talk to the business committee as stakeholders before referral, and they kind of nod and agree. So I think that this has been really valuable outreach. And just to give you an outline of what's here on the slide, we have now either done or in the process of doing presentations to 12 business and trade associations across the metro area, and have engaged with 50 individual businesses in Portland. Those included some of the largest. Oh, I hear Nancy is saying she's having trouble hearing me. And I'll say my internet
got better
connection's
after
not.
the initial, so maybe close to the mic.
Okay. And I'll say the teacher strike is obviously sucking down my bandwidth because now I have kids here doing stuff. So I was saying, overall, I think things have gone pretty well with the business outreach. There's been a lot of action on proactive outreach to the business community. Frequently, I feel like they're not engaged on these bond conversations. And so a lot of positive feedback that we've made the effort. As you'll see on the slide here, we have 12 business and trade associations that have been engaged or are going to be engaged. We're presenting to the Gorge Chamber in Troutdale next week. And then we have a follow-up conversation with the Portland Metropolitan Chamber next week as well. In addition to that, we have engaged 50 individual businesses in the Portland area. That includes 14 meetings with majors and also individual meetings with those in the floodplain. Also done outreach to 19 of the largest employers in the Multnomah County area. Some of them are tax exempt entities, so we have spent less time with them. But generally feel like we've gotten some really good conversations with the public affairs staff on a number of those employers. Also targeted 12 Gresham major employers, 12 Troutdale major employers, and 7 Fairview major employers. Want to advance the slide? So some of our key takeaways.
Oh, wait,
there.
sorry, Jake, I'm going to take this one, but can you just comment sort of in general on impressions of the bond measure as you've been talking?
Sure. So overall, I think there has been a lot of tax sensitivity. That's probably not a surprise to anyone that the business community is more focused on kind of the growing number of taxes that they have faced and have started feeling some feels about that. But I think the good news for you all is over the course of the conversation, almost everybody we've engaged has gotten to yes. Once they see the potential economic impacts and disruptions that a major flood event would have, not just on the floodplain, but on the whole regional economy. I think ironically, the last few years helped people understand the supply chain maybe in a way they hadn't before. And so there's just a lot more of like, oh yeah, if all this critical infrastructure and supply chain is in the floodplain, even though I'm not in the floodplain, that's going to affect our business. But in addition to that, the arguments around the mandatory flood insurance, buying on the private market, the development restrictions that would take place, and kind of understanding that independent of a flood deviation would trigger that, as well as the loss in federal funds, which again, helps to make the case for a tax increase that, you're not going to pay full freight, that there's going to be cost sharing with the federal government and other entities. All of those have been pretty persuasive. And to our date, no businesses have walked away saying, nope, we don't think we should do this. The almost universal feedback has been the idea that, yeah, I don't love paying more taxes, but if we're ever going to pay taxes, this seems like something we've got to do. We do have a ongoing conversation with Metropolitan Chamber, which will be picked up next week, because I understand that there's a desire there to shift a broader conversation around taxes, and our goal is to help them appreciate that this is probably not the area that they should prioritize in trying to shift the landscape. So I think I'll stop there unless there's anything else you want me to add, Noah.
That's great, Jake, and people can come back and ask follow-up questions. We're running over as might be expected, so I will keep my comments very short and allow you all to drive the conversation. This slide has been up for a little while already. I'll just say that some of these takeaways are guiding us as we revise the ballot title and some, so that what you would actually refer, should you choose to do so, to be as compelling as possible. I will say just the only things I wanted to call out here that might be of specific interest. We pushed in the focus groups pretty hard on some of the potential negative messaging, and it's on the question of the combined operating fees and the bond measure. I won't say that people loved the idea of there being additional taxes or fees they would have to pay, but it didn't affect the overall level of support for getting this job done and getting the job done right, especially, and I really emphasize this point, when they see the low cost that they would pay on a monthly basis or an annual basis, people go into it with their hackles up thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a big thing. And then they see like, oh, we can have flood protection for very little money. That really sort of seals the deal. So even with the operating fee, there's still pretty strong support for the bond measure. So let me just go to the really important the recommendations as we've talked about it, and how to integrate all of this into our recommendation to you. This is what I would want to say, that there is a viable path to passing this bond, and that is not an insignificant thing. I want to just emphasize this. This is a tough political climate, as Miranda pointed out. I don't think I need to tell anybody on this call how tough it is out there, and what people's attitudes are towards government. And yet, this makes sense to people. And it makes sense to people, even though they haven't thought that much about flood risk in our region. It hasn't happened at scale in a long time. It makes sense. And as soon as we explain it a little bit, the support grows. But because there's so low awareness, we are really vulnerable to confusion or even mixed or negative messages. So as much as possible on the messaging front, to be clear and unconditional about this is what it does, here's how you benefit, it's straightforward, and it's low cost. That's our winning approach. And across the board, the more that we can come to consensus on what this is, the easier it'll be for people to just vote yes and move on to the next thing, should you choose to do that. And then maybe most importantly, we do see in this environment that it performs. Now, let me just qualify. I think Irene did a good job of saying this. It performs well at all levels. We chose to test in the polling 175 and 225 as kind of mid-range versions of a high and low scenario. They both perform well. The difference is that we stop being able to persuade more people to support, or to solidify the strength of support somewhere around 200 million. That starts to fall off. And so what I would say is, if we're looking to minimize risk and get the best measure out there that gets the job done, there's a sweet spot somewhere between 175 and 200 million that has the best chance of succeeding at the ballot in May. So that's how I would describe it.
I think we have a question from Eric Mueller.
Sure.
No, could you go back to the slide just before this? Yeah, I guess when I had read this earlier, and you had made mention of it a moment ago, I guess I wanted to key in on the last word on the last bullet point and understand, how significant that is. Because to me that indicates a degree of support or not.
I would say that this point draws a lot from Irene's work in the survey, and it's disproportionately people in the floodplain who are saying, when we push them and ask them, would you like us to do the absolute cheapest thing? And they were saying, well, not if it doesn't get the job done right. Like you shouldn't go for more than you need, but you should provide the maximum level of protection that you can. And that's sort of where that comes from.
So maybe if I could just, that last slide of next steps, I just quickly, as we get in discussion, want to make sure you know your opportunities for discussion coming up, and then we'll open the floor and have the rest of the time. So as y'all know, we are really on this road to referral, that December 14th scheduled for vote, and our work between here and there is to hopefully craft something that has the maximum amount of alignment and support. And so these conversations between now and then are really our opportunity to do that, to hear your needs, to hear your issues, to get those out and work with them. Obviously, you have time to ask the consulting team for more information on what they heard from the public today. Between now and the 16th, you'll be getting a draft resolution and staff report that you can take a look at and see. That'll be kind of leave a lot of space open for the direction you want the staff to go on the total value and that kind of thing. But we'll have that time on the discussion on the 16th to talk about implementation, the board role, and then additional time on the 6th. Yeah, with a hope that we have a clear picture for the public on the 14th of the board's support for a measure that we're really working on between now and then. So we'll close then. We can maybe pull down, well, I don't know, folks might want us to flip back and forth through the slides, but move to questions. And
I see Corky and Mary Helen, I think in that
Just
order.
a sec, Jim, before we
Okay.
jump to, and I'll get to Corky and Mary Helen right away. I just wanted to say real quickly, thank you to Carrie, Noah, Miranda, Irene, and Jake. That was extremely informative. Yeah, just thank you for the work. Let's jump to Corky. You're on mute, Corky.
Thank you. Two questions that I think are pretty short. One is about that sweet spot, Noah. When you presented those questions, was it kind of a range of saying, would you like us to spend less or would you like us to spend more? Or was it a more independently asked, is this number or what is the right number sort of thing? In other words, if we gave them a range, of course, they're going to go low. So I'm trying to get a sense of how that played out.
Yeah, I'll let Miranda field that one.
Yeah, so that is always a concern, and we deliberately write.
I saw you smiling when I asked that. So.
No, it's a good question. Some clients don't think of it. So we employed a split sample. So half heard one price tag, half heard another. So they kind of lived in a world where they only heard one, and we're not bargaining with them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks.
So in
that
that
answers
approach,
my question. Thanks. The other question I had.
Hey, Corky, I just wanted to add that the synthesis with the survey work was really helpful because even though it's not statistically valid, we saw the same thing come back in the survey as well. So that was really affirming of that conclusion.
Indeed, helpful to know. Thanks, appreciate it. Now the other thing is, when I look at in one of the early slides where you talked about the overall support, it seemed to me there was movement between the probablys and definitelys, both on the yes and the no side, but not all that much movement between the undecideds into a probably yes. And to me, I think that's what I would want to focus on is the ones that we might be pulling out of leaning no into probably yes. That's really where I'm focusing, because I don't care if somebody's at probably yes and moves to definitely yes. That doesn't really help me on the vote. So my question there is, do you have polling results for just those two undecided group or leaning groups, the leaning yes and the leaning no groups? Could we look at what their answers to all these questions were?
Yeah, we can slice and dice it every which way. One target we often look at is softly positive. So those are the probablys, the leaning yes, and the undecideds all together. So not the people who dismiss us out of hand and not the people who are totally on our side. So that's a segment I could do some homework to look into, you know, who's overrepresented there. So that's one way we might be able to look at who is it worth our time to really talk to.
Yeah, and what I'm trying to get to here is you know, you started breaking down into messages that were compelling. I don't care if a message was compelling to somebody that's already voting for it or already voting against it. I do care what messages were compelling to those who are on the fence. Thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And in a version of this that wasn't 20 minutes, we have a lot more detail and can definitely share pieces of that. Yeah.
Fine. Thank you. Let's go to Mary Helen's question.
Well, first, I want to really clap and applaud and do a cartwheel if I could, because a lot of what I've been asking for months got answered today. And so you've eliminated a lot of my questions that I might have asked. So really, really thank you for all the information I got from all three of you. I do have a question about, you said that people were, and I don't remember which one of you, I'm sorry, polled within the district. What's the district? Urban flood, the urban growth boundary? And I asked this because I have two acquaintances, friends. One lives in Ladd's Addition and one lives in Southwest Portland, and they both got surveys. And after they got the surveys, they called me. And one of the questions they said was, why wouldn't I want to vote for this? Why would I want flooding to happen? And so I thought, and they're both pretty land use experts in the city of Portland, but I didn't know what in the district was. And both of them live a great distance from the flood, but they don't want people they know to suffer. So I wondered how that message was going across to whoever in the district is.
So the poll was conducted inside the urban growth boundary within Multnomah County. So only voters
and Multnomah
within
County.
those.
Okay.
Well,
okay.
It is the voters within the boundary of the urban flood safety and water quality district.
Okay.
So the people
Either one of them were. One's Ladd's Addition at like 14th and Division.
They're in the district.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, all of Multnomah County inside the UGB is inside the urban district's boundary and obligated to pay.
My fault for not knowing that.
No
and
problem.
then the other question is that I got after they got the question, and then people followed up after talking to MCD staff, and I don't know who they talked to, but the answer to why isn't the state paying, and why are we paying on our utility bill for offsite stormwater management? And maybe if that could be in the message, I don't know how many people have that question. Like I said, it's only 2 or 3, but I don't have the bandwidth to ask any number of people. So that might be something that would get those probably people that might have that question, is like, why should I pay when I don't live there and somebody else owns the levee, that sort of thing. Then with that also is there's Nancy might have more info on this, but the residential infill project has changed as far as like expediting permits for people that want to build small housing on lots. And has that had any effect on how people view the protection of the floodplain? I live in a neighborhood, East Columbia, that's probably, I don't know how many % built in a floodplain, but that would be a concern because, and is a concern because of a 12-unit development that's trying to be built on a lot that they don't think should be. So I wondered that, coupled with everybody just getting their property taxes, would they have answered differently after they saw what their property taxes were?
Go ahead, Noah.
No, I'm just, there was a lot in there.
Sorry. Well, okay, then I'll ask one at a time. Would they answer differently after they just got their property taxes?
Well, I think they just had actually when we went out. So that would be
okay, because I just got mine in the mail last week. So
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we typically try to avoid doing it right after. I think partly because they won't get their tax bill right before they vote either. So that kind of mirrors reality a little bit more.
Okay.
But I will say, just very on to the point of price sensitivity, you know, we pushed pretty, you can only do so much in a poll, but we pushed pretty hard in the focus groups. We pushed this question of paying for something where, that doesn't affect you directly. We heard very strongly that people understood the sense of shared responsibility, that this made sense, that we all had to do this together, and that the cost seemed very reasonable to people. The cost was actually one of our strongest persuasion messages was, oh, I can get all of that for, compared to all these other things on my bill, this is very little. And so, you know, that in general, the response was positive to the price.
Okay, well, that's good to hear because I've heard a number of people say, you know, $8 a month might be not much or a little amount. And to low income people that are living paycheck to paycheck, $8 a month is a bag of groceries and dinner. So I think you really addressed, and there was a lot of comments about paying attention to limited income people, but maybe using those terms of just the dollar amounts might be, I don't know. You guys are the experts, but the comments I've got is $8 might not be very much to you because I was using that. So I just started saying the projected amount is $8 a month. I think you answered the specifics of what it would do to them for $8 a month as opposed to becoming homeless if their house flooded. But that kind of message, I guess, is important to limited income people.
Thank you, Mary Helen. And I know when we get to Nancy, I think she can probably take a stab at answering some of the questions you brought up for her as well. Let's go to Eric right now.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate this. First question is for Noah. As I read this report, what I take away first and foremost is that we have soft but persuadable base of support. And so as you look at the activities that our board will have to ramp up, how much do we have to raise in terms of dollars for an appropriate campaign to educate the public? What should we be thinking about?
Yeah, it's an excellent point. I agree. That's the risk in soft support. So I would say number one, the most important thing is to avoid as much negative messaging as possible, because the more things are negative or confusing, the more expensive it gets to tell people a positive story. That's why Jake's work that he presented to you is so important. That you know, one of the most compelling arguments might come from the business community. This is the wrong time, too many taxes. And I think that the fact that we're able to say this is essential, it's within a limited period of time of opportunity for the federal match, it's good value, all of that is really helping. And so to the extent that we ourselves can present a clear message and that we don't face too much negative messaging, that puts us in the best position. This, you know, of course, I would love to have as much money as possible to get a better message out there. I'm working with Jake and the client team at MCDD to do paid digital ads and mail that is educational in nature, not directly persuasive, which is, you know, not the best, but you can do that with public dollars, and it's important, as some of you might know from other measures. So we will have 2 mailers and some digital information ads out there. That's important and will help. Ideally, I'll be honest with you, I would love to have a campaign of, you know, $200,000 to $300,000 after referral to get positive messages out there. That would be kind of the minimum of a small, you know, scrappy campaign. I realize that might sound like a fortune to everybody on this call, but that would be my honest answer.
Okay, no, thanks very much. And the second part of my question is really for Miranda. Over the past 3 or 4 weeks, I've had extensive discussions with Jim about the impact of the interest rate that we have assumed in this bond measure. And what I want to test is if we were at AA rated bond, what that would mean is that the payment due from homeowners using the $218,000 that's value, blah, blah, blah. But using that would go down to about $19.95. So I know from my business background that there are certain magic numbers. Getting the amount that's owed per thousand down to less than 10 cents or 9 cents may have an impact. Based upon your experience in this polling, is it worthwhile for us to push for that number that is slightly, has that magic number kind of impact?
So is the question whether to get it to 9 cents versus 11 cents or
9 versus 14, right?
Okay.
Does that make a difference to the voter?
Yeah, I think that's something we could probably test and see how dramatic a difference it makes. But I think when you're at the level of about 5 cents, it's probably not too terribly meaningful. I think the average voter doesn't know too much about bonds and how they work, but they do know that assessed value calculation. So if it's possible, I think it would be a plus, but I think the polling shows that if we're around that figure that Noah mentioned, that we're probably in a good place.
Okay, got it. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Let's go to Nancy.
Thank you. So I just wanted to say I was struck by two things. One, about the business case, like the businesses understand the business case scenario, which makes a lot of sense, but it definitely came through very clearly in the presentation. And also something I wasn't surprised about the nature-based solutions being a strong selling point. That didn't surprise me at all, but I'm glad it came forward in the polling. So my question for, I'm not sure who, is of all of those, you showed a map of where you polled people inside the urban district boundaries. Towards the south of that, there's a bunch of people in the Johnson Creek floodplain, and they flood, every 5 or 10 years or so. And this urban district won't protect them from flooding directly. I wonder if you had, I know we didn't ask you to do this, but I'm wondering if there would be a way to notice, did you get, those people was like, yeah, this is good for everybody. It's good for me too. I wonder if you got less of that, or, hey, why aren't they doing my flooding? Or if any of that came through in those geographies. Maybe that's something, I don't know, is that something you can look at based on your voluminous information?
I don't think we could get down to within a few blocks of that area or anything that granular without doing a lot of oversampling. But we could kind of look at that quadrant and see if there's a difference. I think geographically, when we did look at different kind of regions of Portland versus Gresham and so on, we didn't see very dramatic differences by geography. It was really a lot more about, things like partisanship or homeowner renter, things like that really change people's opinion on the ballot measure itself. So, but we can dig in, and see what's there.
And Nancy, I would just emphasize that in both the poll and the focus groups, even for people who weren't proximate to the Columbia River, we really stressed we were talking about the Columbia River. Right. So that somebody from Southwest Portland in the focus group recognized, and even in the focus groups, we're not fixing your storm drain. That's not what this is about. This is something different. And they got it. So you could always do more,
that's
but
great.
I think we were pretty explicit.
I don't think we need to do more polling. I was just wondering if there was any, if you looked in those southern blocks, if there was any trends. But so if you could have a brisk look, that would be great. But I understand, Jim, overall, we did get a lot of positive response, people thinking about the whole region instead of just their own backyard, which is great. And Mary Helen, if you have stormwater questions, why don't we just connect offline and hash through some of them, and then we can bring any major messages back to this group.
Sounds good. Thanks, Nancy.
Cheers.
Thanks, Nancy. Let's go to Emerald.
Hi, everyone. Just first off, thanks for this. This is really good news. These are overall good results contextually for the region right now. I'm not surprised to see it hold decently and also kind of in the soft zone. So what that points to is the need to really make sure that it's right sized, so that we can stick with a narrative of it being, essential but modest against the anti-tax fervor of the region. And really kudos for the business outreach, especially to the business organizations. Something like that, it feels like this could be pretty vulnerable to definitely organized or funded opposition. But even I'm interested in how vulnerable it is to just oppositional messages, even if not super well funded. And I know that's hard to say right now, but it's just something that's rattling around in my head when you think about the political context of the region and the really high noise of the 2024 election cycles.
I'll take a stab, Emerald. I think it is vulnerable. And I think that's why you see us putting a lot of emphasis on endorsements and on a lack of conflict here in this board, some unanimity of support or lack of opposition. And, Eric Molander, back to your question in terms of a campaign, more is always better. And I'm doing some work on my own time to try and get a jump start on some of that work. Happy to share that with any of you. But I think one of the things we're really going to need to focus on is getting editorials, endorsements, and we're going to need to have a good voters pamphlet with lots of businesses and organizations and neighborhoods and so on submitting voters pamphlet statements. And I think if we can achieve those two things, we have a pathway to success. So that's what we're thinking about. And Emerald, we appreciate your help with the Portland Chamber and meeting with Alaska Airlines and some of the other employers. And so if any of you do have connections to employers who might be willing to say something kind or lack of opposition, that would be awesome, and we will chase them down. I hope that answers your question, but we're vulnerable, but we're better off than other measures in a starting place.
It wasn't really a well-formed question anyway. It was more of an elevating of, this is good information, really instructive, really helpful, and there's some caution to be found in here.
That's right.
The only thing I would add, just from my observations, and Miranda jump into it, I wouldn't, as opposed to other things I've worked on, it's not like there's a silver bullet negative message. It's not like this thing, it's not vulnerable in the sense that people think it doesn't make sense or that they're against it. Where it's vulnerable is everybody is so skeptical right now. And if you cast any doubt and give people reason to question what you're saying, they just don't trust government. They're not in the mood to believe things. So that's the impact of negative messaging, that it could push people into not believing or trusting. But I did want to emphasize that I'm not finding that even on the tax issue, this seems reasonable to most people. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Thanks. Thanks, Emerald. Thanks, others. I have my own question, and it's not really a question for anyone specific. I think it's a question for the group. It's about competition that we might see if we choose as a board to go in May. What we know might be out there, and I know we're not going to know everything, but what are we aware of? And I'll mention that we've learned recently in Gresham that Gresham City Council wants us to go on the May ballot for public safety levy, try number 2, which failed last May. And so there is some competition in Gresham. Maybe the question I have is anyone aware of anything else that might be on the ballot from your respective kind of areas, and maybe a general comment from anyone that wants to try to answer about what the impact of competition might have for us, if there is. A year ago was it a year or 2 years ago that we had the Multnomah County and Metro measures that were pretty sizable for some on the ballot that impacted some, but I'll leave it at that. And
Steve, maybe Miranda could start with her experience on how voters view multiple measures, and then we can go into what else might be on the ballot, if that's okay.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a perennial concern across everywhere we do our research. I think, one factor that we often say is we don't see a ton of evidence that people are sort of saying, I'm only going to vote for one thing this year. They kind of come to each measure thinking, is this the right mechanism? Is the amount not too painful? Do I feel like we need to do this? And do I trust the people who are going to be in charge of it? And so on those individual metrics, that's why the pieces of the poll kind of ask those questions in different ways, and you look in a decent position there. I'll also say if there's a possibility to do further research when we've got one final ballot title, add some of the more different message themes and things like that, we can also test maybe an opposition message or even a statement at the beginning that kind of does that laundry list of here's all the other stuff you're going to be asked to consider. Here's another piece of it. We frequently find it doesn't make too much of a difference, but that's always something important to keep in mind. So.
Anybody aware of anything that's out there that Ashton?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Good conversation. A lot of good questions answered. We will be going to the ballot in May for a zoo bond renewal. It won't increase. It'll stay where we are at our current rate. So that's all I have.
Probably the only thing more popular than water quality is the zoo.
Jim, this is Marielle from Metro. Just want to clarify, Metro Council has not yet referred that, so it isn't quite a done deal. So I just wanted to make that little technical correction.
But they're aiming to, correct? I'm not aware of anything else. I have heard maybe PBOT is kicking something around. It could be Portland Parks is still looking for a special district. But I haven't heard anything specific on those things just yet.
Thanks.
I believe that PPS has a levy that will expire, but I don't know if they've actually decided to go forward with renewal.
Thanks, Jake. So if I may just wrap up, thank you for this conversation. Again, I want to let you know we're working hard to finalize some draft referral documents and staff reports that start to increase the accountability for follow through. And so Carrie and Colin's team is working with our consultants. So you should see some of those draft documents really soon. And what we really need from you in order to stay on track is for you to study those documents and please, as soon as you are able, articulate any concerns or needs you have so we can try and address them. I want to close, I think, with what I see here is really pretty good support, higher support than we've started out in other measures that I've worked on. I think one of our greatest challenges is really twofold. One, nobody knows who we are. That can be a benefit. They don't hate us. But the other is that because they don't know who we are, our issue is not top of mind, like homelessness or crime or housing. And so we do need to invest some time in trying to get those endorsers and editorial endorsements so that when people grab their ballot and go to vote, they'll look for some trusted people who say, yeah, this is worth doing. And I think if we can do that, we can be successful. So that's what I'm aiming to set up on the campaign side in my spare time, and where we'll need your support if you choose to go ahead and refer a measure. I hope that was helpful. And thanks to our team, they've done an awful lot of good work. And it's fun to see people talk about our stuff and generally be receptive to it. I will say, sitting through the two focus groups a week or so ago, all the skepticism and the, downtown's like Mad Max and all of that, but it was really reassuring to me that at some level, every single one of those participants acknowledged their civic responsibility to invest in critical infrastructure and how important it is. So there's something kind of buoying about that maybe it's like serving on a jury. It kind of reminds you that, hey, we're part of something bigger here. So it was pretty inspiring to me. And I think there's a path forward. So with your permission, we'll go for it. And if not, we'll figure out a better way.
Excellent. Thanks, Jim. Thanks, staff. Wonderful, wonderful work. Wonderful presentation. Good discussion. Let's move on to our next topic. And we have Reed Wagner here, who's going to talk about...
I'm going to kick it off based on some feedback that I've received. So
excellent. This is the alternative fee strategy. Go ahead, Jim.
Right. Wendy, are you going to put a slide or two up for me? We don't have very many. So first, thank you for entertaining more conversation about legislative modifications. We're between Reed and me, we're going to talk about the following things. I want to acknowledge that there was an interesting and I think very powerful and beneficial interplay between the urban board and the legacy boards. And I want to acknowledge that I didn't communicate very effectively after hearing from the legacy boards with the urban board. So I want to own that. And so last time when we were talking about it, I know some of you didn't know why. So I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're talking about this. As I think most of you know, several board members raised some concerns about the staff recommended approach. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we captured those. And then we did bring on Reed Wagner, who I think all of you or most of you have spoken with or know. And we did ask him and his team to do a deep dive into some of the operating revenue concerns that Councilor Ritma and others expressed very articulately. And then there were a range of other concerns that Reed helped us with, but that I'll present, and then we'll turn it into some discussion time for you, depending on how we do. So that's the presentation. So if we can get started, I'll dive in. Next slide. So real briefly, the bottom line is we really need, the bottom line is really the bottom line is we really want a lack of opposition if we're going to try and move something in the legislature. And it was clear that we had some serious and legitimate concerns from some of the board members. And so we felt like in the spirit of this whole project, going back almost a decade, where when concerns are raised, even if we have a majority, it's worth it to try and bring others along. And I felt like that was really important. And several board members supported that approach and actually insisted on it in a really thoughtful way. So we did some more work. And the goal, again, is to address actual flood risk and get our federal money and have a strong bond rating. And we need to have a legislative success to do that. So we really wanted to ensure we could bring more of the board with us when we were going down to Salem. I think the other things that you guys are well aware of are the revenue situation is challenging. It's not dire, but in the next few years, we really do need a different revenue system to sustain our operation. And really our path forward is to set up the new district to do that. So we need that legislative change. And then last, I think you've all experienced, maybe not to the degree your staff has, that it's just really expensive and not very efficient to work for 7 boards. And so we're very anxious to improve and streamline our governance. So that's why we're talking about this, but it really is driven by the need to be successful in the short session of the legislature. To be successful, we need to not have active opposition. So we're doing the extra work to try and avoid that. Next slide. Concerns that were raised by board members, and again, my apologies to any board member if I don't get it exactly right. These are trying to be headlines to articulate the general direction of the concern. I think we all know there's a broad desire to not use assessments on the floodplain because of their contribution to compression. I think if we did a show of hands and said, hey, how many of you would like a better method? You'd all say yes. So that concern needs additional work. Seth and others had asked if it would be possible for the cities to maintain the taxing authority rather than the district getting authority to tax cities. And the emphasis on that was not having the League of Cities or others oppose us in Salem. So we'll talk more about what we're doing with that concern. Tanny and Eric and some others expressed concerns about the timing of transferring the assessment authority revenue to the new district and the timing of dissolution, and how an inarticulate timing adventure there could create some potential liability for legacy board members. And they believe, and I agree, that they should not be held liable for anything they don't control. So we need to talk about indemnification and the timing of the revenue transfer and dissolution. And we'll talk more about that. Several legacy boards have expressed concerns about generating revenue from their legacy district landowners and having that revenue be used outside of the historic district of that, the historic district boundaries. And so we're working on some techniques to restrict any cash balances or carryover dollars so that they could only be used inside those districts. And we'll talk more about that. And then finally, there was some general concerns about the timing of the election, that it was really quick. And we've done some additional work with Multnomah County, and we now know that the soonest we can do the board election would be in November of 2024. And there's some really good benefits that I think come from that. And I'll discuss that in just a minute. So those were the concerns. And we're going to go through what we've been able to accomplish in the last couple of weeks to address those concerns. And we're going to start with Reed Wagner talking a little bit about the floodplain revenue generation and the assessments. So with that, I'll turn it over to Reed, and then I'll go through the others and we'll have a chance for questions and discussion. Reed, you want to take it away? And I don't think Reed has slides, so you don't need to look at this slide unless you are enjoying the nice blank white space.
Thanks, Jim. First of all, wow, that was an incredible presentation. Really great team that you brought on. But just in the course of my 20 plus years working in this region, the fact that that was the discussion you were having today just shows how much work this board has done and the staff has done over the last couple of years, and it was really exciting. I will also start by letting you know that I don't have nearly as much data or information as that team in the first half of the meeting, but I had really, really good conversations with folks. And and engaging board members who had ideas that they wanted to share. In such a short period of time, I wasn't sure that I'd be able to speak with most of the board members, but I was able to speak with 13 board members in the last couple of weeks. And then even more stakeholders and staff, trying to just get the understanding of what these concerns were moving forward. So, first of all, related to that GO bond funding, the federal funding is reliant on a local match, and you all know this, and that's a great thing that we're in that position. 35 million is always better than 135 million. Stable operating revenue is needed to secure the GO bond and get the best bond rating, which to Eric's point is extremely important. The board, as Jim was talking about, did pass modifications so that assessments could be transferred and benefits tax could be put into place. But the concerns that were raised were about the long-term impacts of compression, not necessarily the impacts today, but what's going to happen in the future. The second concern was that once these property assessments were put into place for the new district, is there any need to revisit more equitable solutions, such as user fees in the future? So those were pretty common. So to have more alignment, or at least less strong opposition, we had these conversations, and we discussed the legislative modifications, some proposed ideas, and how to move forward in more alignment. We will share a memo after this meeting. We wanted to wait until this meeting in case any discussion should be added to the memo. So here's some of the general themes that came up in these conversations, which is where I always like to start, especially when people are coming from different directions on things. Failing to establish a more reliable, stable revenue source for the district poses a real threat of losing federal funding. The board should do all it can to avoid that outcome. That was a pretty general, common theme, consistent across everybody I spoke with. I won't say a consensus, but pretty close. Positioning the district to get the best bond rating possible should be a priority. And we need to reduce the impact of compression. Though compression is not currently a widespread factor given the real estate market, the initial board and the new district board should continue to actively seek solutions that reduce the impacts of compression in the long run. Those were the three most common themes and most consistent themes. We also talked through proposals, including user fees, such as those proposed by Councilor Ripma, broadening the benefits tax, using solely the benefits tax with multiple rates. And I'll say, in general, it's complicated. These are not light switch kind of decisions or things that can be analyzed in a short period of time, because they take a lot of stakeholder outreach. They take a lot of legal testing, financial modeling, all of those things. They're innovative ideas and they deserve attention. But I'm going to go quickly through some of these that we talked through. The first proposal was to shift more revenues from property assessments to a benefits tax than is currently proposed. So if assessments are 60%, as an example, and the benefits tax is 40%, what if we shifted that, switched it around? And this option is feasible and could be considered if applied with an equitable share of cost to the floodplain. So what benefits are the floodplain getting and what are the costs associated with it? If the state legislature passes the board's approved modifications, this can be a conversation in the future. So probably in the 2025, 2026 timeframe. The second proposal was to apply a benefits tax with two rates. This option needs further legal review. There may be issues with measures 5 and 50 and complications with collection. In addition to legal review, there would need to be engagement with stakeholders, significant engagement with stakeholders. A benefits tax at floodplain level would need to go to the direct beneficiaries. So we get back into more complicated formulas, which we talked about, or I think you talked about in the utility model. This could be considered in the future, assuming the legislative modifications occur. But it's, again, the timeline out a couple of years for consideration. The third proposal that was suggested by Councilor Ripma, very innovative ideas with a user fee imposed on 3 types of floodplain users. That would be residents, employees, and people traveling through. In general, the 3-tiered user fee creates a relationship between usage of the managed floodplain and fees applied. The challenge with this multi-user proposal is associated with the difficulty of collecting these various, how do you collect it fairly and efficiently are the main issues. As the proposal suggests on its own, this will likely need legislative action and could be costly. When discussing the issues, some stakeholders indicated a strong desire for robust and intentional stakeholder engagement to inform potential decisions about using a mechanism like this. Some also noted that the state legislature is unlikely to consider this type of proposal in the upcoming short session. Other considerations of the multi-tiered user fee include floodplain residents. So further financial review is needed. If we just look at the fact that the proposal was $319, I think it was, per resident, and you have an average of over 2 residents per household, especially in multi-dwelling buildings where they pay very little currently because they don't have a lot of acreage or impervious area, their costs would go up substantially. So that's a challenge with that. With transients, so people traveling through the floodplain, gaining support for including a transients portion of the fees would likely require substantial efforts to align political stakeholders. And that's including the port, whose legal counsel has determined this would not be legal to collect the fee. Certainly somebody might be able to challenge that, but it's not a good starting point. This is going to take time to get through this conversation. In regards to the tolling portion of it, Governor Kotek announced a pause on all toll collections until January 2026 because of concern about impacts on vulnerable communities. So again, this is something, it's not that it can't be discussed, it's just probably something that is going to be a couple years out. So given these factors and the transition to the new board following the November election, that board would be well positioned to consider some of these things. But I think the desire to just hope that it's talked about in the future is not strong, that people are concerned that this is going to fall off. And so we suggest that the initial board develop an official recommendation about potential long-term adjustments the new elected board can consider once they're in office in 2025. Task force consisting of a subset of board members of the initial board and the cities that would be most impacted by this and probably have to implement them is recommended. In greater detail, the recommendation should evaluate a broad array of potential revenue solutions, including, but not limited to, because you want new ideas to be vetted, the user fee and revenue models previously suggested, suggestions developed by and in collaboration with MCDD staff, and the utility user fee model. I think there's still potential. It may be a longer timeline, but still potential. So the recommendation should include anticipated financial, legal, and implementation requirements. Should also consider the equitable and efficient collection of revenues, including ways to mitigate potential negative impacts on low-income individuals. So in anticipation of that work, I think if you can give staff enough time to do the scoping and due diligence, maybe identify folks for that task force in the spring and get the task force started in July. So to have an official recommendation for the new board to consider fees other than assessments in the future, I think you would satisfy a lot of the need to work through these things and not just leave it hanging for future consideration. So that's, in general, the conversations I had and suggestions that I narrowed into a possible way to path forward. So maybe I'll stop there and let any questions or discussion happen, or if Jim, you need to follow on with anything.
You guys have been getting talked at for a long time here. I want to acknowledge that. I wouldn't mind having like 3 minutes to go through some of the other concerns and kind of summarize the actions that we're engaged in, if that works for the board. And then we should have a decent amount of time for questions and discussion. Does that work for folks? Sorry to be talking at you so much. Wendy, could you put my slides up? Because I will forget some of the points. So just to go through kind of in summary what staff is currently engaged in. So we have our outside counsel, Jeff Condit, and Brian Sheets, SDIC's general counsel, and also Armand Resto-Spots. The three of them are working on some language to include in the legislative amendments that would align the transfer of assessment authority to the new district with dissolution of the legacy districts to avoid zombie boards or any potential that a legacy board member with no revenue would be held accountable for something they can't control. So we are in full agreement that that needs to be addressed. And it appears there's a path forward where our two councils are able to find a specific written solution. That work remains in process, like a lot of these things. So I want you to know we don't have the solution yet, but I am optimistic based on what I've heard that the two lawyers are going to be able to work something out. On Seth's concern that the cities get the taxation authority versus the district to avoid additional opposition in Salem, Jeff Condit has been instructed to look for solutions that implement in that direction, and he is currently working on that. As many of you know, Mr. Condit's father recently passed away, and he's just coming back to work. We had hoped to have language yesterday, but there's more work happening on that. So my regrets for not having it for you. And I don't have a clear answer, but we're working hard to limit any opposition from other cities by being strategic and thoughtful about how we allocate that taxing authority. We also know that we like the belt and suspenders approach on indemnification. So in addition to addressing any risk through alignment of assessments and dissolution, we're looking at adding some additional language to the statute and elevating for your and the legacy board's awareness the Oregon Tort Claims Act and some other places where legacy board members should feel more confident or entirely confident that they will be indemnified for any actions for which they don't have authority going forward. Concerns were raised by a number of the legacy boards about using revenue generated from the historic district for a purpose in that district, moving to some other geography. And so we are prepared to introduce a proposed budget for year one of the urban district that thoroughly restricts use of any carryover cash from the legacy districts for purposes in those districts. MCDD may be a little bit different because they help temper everything, but certainly for Penn 2 and for SDIC, staff agrees with those boards that we should restrict use of their funds to their districts. And so we're working on language to do that. And then as I mentioned earlier, in working with Multnomah County on board elections, the timeframes are such that we won't be able to have a board election until November of 2024. And so staff would recommend that, and that the board, the elected and appointed board, not begin service until January of 25. And one of the reasons for that is then it gives the legacy board representatives on the interim board a chance to have more influence and authority over wrapping up the dissolution process. And finally, it also gives all of you all who have been with us for all this time to really continue to help shape and drive continued dialogue and hopefully improvements in the operating revenue through the task force that Reed mentioned. So we're excited as your staff to help scope that this spring and include in my proposed budget for year one adequate revenue to carry out that task force so that this interim board can make some solid recommendations going into January of 25. And we could either use the session to fix things or the new board can incorporate revenue into its next budget to implement any recommendations coming out of that task force. So we have worked really in collaboration with the board. Next slide, just real quick. We've really worked with the board members who raised these concerns to the degree we could access them to try and design these actions to address their concerns. I want to remind you that because it's the short session, we really do need a lack of active opposition. We don't necessarily need endorsements from all of you, but we need a lack of opposition. And then just a final reminder coming from the polling and everything else, the reason we're here is that we have growing flood risk and a changing climate. We have an opportunity to get federal investment if we act now. And those two things really require prompt action. So we're hopeful that the work that we have undertaken in the last 2 weeks demonstrates an ongoing commitment to address the concerns raised by every board member, and that we're getting increasing comfort that we can move forward in a way that benefits this region and help stand up that new district. So with that, I'll stop talking and we're happy to entertain discussion or questions. And thank you for letting us talk at you for so long today.
Thanks, Jim. Thanks, Reed. That was great. Let's open it up for discussion, comments, questions. I think that was very, and from my perspective, just very useful to get all the updates of kind of how you're trying to address the concerns that have been raised by various board members and bring us more into alignment. So thank you very much for that. I see Mary Helen's hand. Go ahead.
Jim, thank you for talking at us because you gave us a lot of good information. So I think talking at us is talking for us, or I don't know. I'm not going to use the wrong words. My question is a couple. When you said about the restrict use of legacy district cash transfer funds for purposes in the district, does that include or restrict it to use of what we told the property owners what their funds would be used for?
Yes.
I can answer that, Jim.
Yeah, go ahead, Lori. Yeah.
So what I'm looking at, Mary Helen, is typical operating expenses, so maintenance and some administrative support that we usually do charge those districts, as well as there are specific projects that have been identified for each of the districts that need to be completed. And so those are the things that we would track and use those dollars to spend.
Okay.
And then just a quick project example, Mary Helen, is the discharge pipes challenge in Penn 2, right? We've identified, you've raised and allocated capital funds to complete that project, and we're gonna use those funds for that purpose.
Okay.
Yeah, because we have grant money for that project, but it doesn't cover 100% of the cost.
And that's just an example.
Correct. So, and that was one of the major things. And we've been working with Bill on that. And I just wanted to make sure that all those neighbors that he's been helping, are able to fulfill their wishes or whatever. But anyway, so the other question, and I might have misunderstood, or very well could have misunderstood. The loan that we have from the city is $1.4 million every year. Have we used that up as well?
1.2 million a year for the urban district, and we have taken full draws every year so far on that loan.
So we only have one left, or how many left?
We have one this year. I know we have one that we can use for the following year, and it's possible, but I need to double check this. I think we have one more year after that.
I think that we'd be at 5 at that point.
We have 5 altogether.
Okay. No, I just had lost track of the numbers and knew you could answer, and I wouldn't have to search through my notes.
Yeah, and when we talk about the cash flow for the urban district, which is coming in the near future, that is really a key component for us, is having that loan money from the city to be able to kind of fulfill the cash flow needs that we're going to have in those early months before the assessments would start coming in.
Okay, and then lastly, if I can be of any help, I've been asked to be on a citizens board for s- Mike Dembro and Travis Nelson and Tana Sanchez of what citizens want to hear about, and sort of making that brief. And so if there's something that I can add to that, I'd be more than happy, but I don't know which legislatures are supporting our efforts, or are we asking everybody possible? And the third is if somebody could give me some correct talking points besides it's a great thing and we need to get this done. I would be more than happy to mention that as one of my comments as a member of this committee.
Terrific. We'll prepare those talking points and share them with you. And we are working with a range of legislators, but the two local delegation members who we're working most closely with are Rep. Nelson and Senator Gorsuch.
Senator, what was the last one?
Gorsuch.
Oh, okay, good. Because Lou Frederick asked me about it, and I see him because of all other reasons. So,
And
okay,
and
thank you.
we've
If
been
you
in
can,
touch. We've been in touch with Lou and his team as well. So, but for committee purposes, Gorsuch is pretty key, and he's been a terrific supporter.
Okay, so thank you. And I'll look forward because I don't want to misspeak or misrepresent by saying or sounding trivial by saying it's a good thing. Vote for this. So okay, thanks.
Thank you for offering to help spread the word. That'll be helpful.
Excellent. Go ahead, Corky.
I apologize. First of all, thanks. Great presentations. The polling, the focus groups, Reed's report, all of it really informative. Thanks, folks. Maybe I missed it, but when we were talking about the new board being installed in January 2025, elected in November 2024, that was news to me. Can we get a timeline? What's linked to what? So it's not that I don't really even care whether the new board, well, maybe I do, I don't know, whether the new board comes online this summer or in January, but I do want to know what's linked to what. So when do the legacy districts dissolve? I presume that's connected to the new board being installed, things like that. So that would be really helpful. I think it's a fairly simple graph.
Yeah, and it's absolutely. Thank you for the request, and we need to pull that together. And it was, candidly, as we were working to prepare that, was when we worked with outside counsel and discovered a requirement that Multnomah County has that precedes what we have to do. And they can't do that till we do our thing. And so again, we're working to develop it. Broadly speaking, our goal would be to have the new revenues begin July 1st and to settle with this board from that July 1st period through January, when the regular board, the elected by voters and appointed by the governor board, would start in January. So that's the general time frame. But we'll write it down for you, and we need to, really do the detail work to make sure we've got it right. But I think we're getting closer.
Yeah, it'd be great to see that, and I presume you're checking with council about that legality, because what we always pitched for years before this board was created was, well, this board will, get the GO bond on the ballot, raise a new revenue structure, and then go away, and the new board comes in and spends the money, sort of thing. If we're changing that, then we definitely want to have council kind of look at ORS 550.
Yeah, not changing it, just trying to embed it with the local elections law and the county's obligations under the law, and our operating revenue has to start flowing, and the sequence becomes very important.
Exactly. Yeah. Thanks.
Thanks for the question, and we will try and get you a graphic or an easier to digest diagram of how these things play together, or don't, as the case might be.
I can't help myself. I like easy. When you said an easy diagram.
Yeah. Thanks, Mary Helen. Other questions, comments?
Okay. I can't resist the silence. So thank you all for raising the issues that you've raised. Thank you for staying with staff as we've tried to figure out how best to respond to them. I would ask you, please, if things are bothering you or you have something that you think might be a concern, that the sooner you can articulate it either privately to me or to one of the team members or to Steve, the sooner we're going to be able to try and help address it or clarify it. And because the time frame really is tight and the interest rates are important and the federal match is important, please, please, please do your best. And I know we're throwing a lot at you. So anytime a concern raises is a good time to tell us. But the earlier you can flag those things for us, the easier it'll be for us to help you figure it out. So thank you for sticking to it. I want to, special shout out to Councilor Ritma. He's been so consistent and principled on this issue. And I think he's made a fundamental difference in how we're moving forward, thanks to others who kind of rallied to help him get his voice heard. For the rest of you, really appreciate the critiques and concerns. I think we're going to have a stronger product because of your work. So sooner is better, please.
We got Mary Helen and then Rochelle.
Mine's just quick. To your easy graph of things, can you put in there when when the deadline for FEMA is, or what deadline we're working up against? Because I think on some of the public opinion polls it said it would be optimal because we get FEMA match. So maybe just for the board members, or maybe just me, I don't care, is what's at stake for us if we don't meet that FEMA deadline to get the matching funds?
Thanks, Mary Helen. Rochelle?
Yes, we'll try.
Okay, thanks, Steve. So this is a question, perhaps it was explained to the board before I joined my first meeting, I think it was back in August. I'm curious how the split that you arrived at for the 10% versus the 20% for property assessments, even at the 10% level, that, if I recall correctly, that means it's about $11 million that's being raised for property assessments, and then approximately 6 or 7 million coming from the flood safety benefit tax. And so roughly it's 2/3 of operating revenue coming from within the managed floodplain and the balance coming from outside. And so I'm curious, that rough split, 2/3, 1/3, was it just a general feeling and the board had consensus? Did you consider lower? Because the more I've heard through the polling and the conversations about the regional benefit and the supply chain issues, I could see that perhaps that regional benefit is so strong that it could make sense to have more than 1/3 of the operating be borne by that broader region. And so just would welcome a bit more background about how you arrived at that rough 2/3, 1/3 split.
I think that the honest answer is that's a kind of a coincidence.
Okay.
We were looking at different versions for the board members to start to understand what is the impact when we have a common rate across the floodplain? What is the impact when we start to do changes to that rate? And it's hard because trying to estimate what's going to happen to individual property real market values makes the compression calculation really, really difficult. So we are doing another round of analysis because we've got updated information from Multnomah County. Sorry, I worked too long in Washington County. So we are going to be coming back right after the first of the year to share that new analysis with the board. And we're actually, because there were some concerns about shifting of costs, we're going to look at 0, 5, and 10% rate increase on the floodplain to see what that looks like for particular individual properties, as well as for specific regions. We're also having Eco Northwest help us to calculate again any impact, because we heard at the city of Troutdale that they were worried that by us coming into play with the compression, that they might experience more compression and lose funding at the city. And so we've asked for some analysis to share with the board on that impact as well. It is a really difficult calculation, so I don't want folks to say, well, you just didn't do it right the first time. There's a lot of complexity to it, and when we get updated data, it's really helpful to use that information to be able to rerun the numbers. So we will be coming back with more information. It is a decision that we need to make as a board when we start to look at the budget for the first year of the urban district. We'll be talking a little bit more about timelines there, because we have a little bit of a challenging timeline when it comes to the budget for 24-25. But we will be looking at kind of some of these major components that are going to impact the budget early in the beginning of the next calendar year, so that you can get a sense and start to give us a feel of what direction you want us to go with that. So we will have more information for the board on that calculation, which, depending on the decision or the direction that you give us to go with the assessments, will impact the plug, which is the flood safety benefit tax.
Okay, thank you, Lori.
You're welcome.
No, I was just gonna add, I mean, thank you, Lori. I was gonna also mention that we hadn't voted on that as a board, so it hasn't been set. But obviously the cities have different interests here. Gresham and Wood Village have an interest in not having the cost shifted too much outside of the managed floodplain, because we happen, Wood Village in that case has no property in the managed floodplain. We have very little. So the concept of kind of fairness and who's benefiting directly and who's indirectly, and tying the cost of services to the benefits received has always been a high, I think, priority of ours. I know that.
Yeah, and I just recall some of the conversations sort of building off the current level of assessments. So here's what we get now, and there's some limited tolerance for additional increases, which is why we had to do the whole new district in the first place. And then working from the other end with the board to get down to what that year one forecast was, then you've got the two variables that you have to play with. And candidly, our consultants who are helping us with the bond were consistently whispering in our ear, don't shift too much cost to the whole district or it'll hurt your bond campaign. And so that's kind of politically where we landed, and why we came back with hold essentially status quo with some amount of rate increase, which is undecided yet, and put the rest on the region, because they're also picking up the capital costs through the bond.
Other questions, comments?
Better place than last meeting, still bad place. How are we doing, folks?
I think better for sure. And if you guys keep this awkward silence up, I'm gonna make an announcement.
Okay, can I just say one thing? I
Sure.
can't do cartwheels, but if I could, and in my dreams, I'd be doing cartwheels, because I got more information now, and able to formulate things that I keep getting answered or asked and then try to answer. So for me personally, selfishly, this has been a wonderful, informative meeting. So thank you to everybody that gave at least me the information.
Glad you got your answers finally. Sorry it took so long.
Thanks for that, Mary Helen. Thanks for that positive comment. Eric.
Just in terms of, in responding to Jim's question about how are they doing, I mean, I'm encouraged by the efforts and the actions and the discussion that's taken place since the last meeting. I've been contacted a couple of times. I've had some useful conversations, had a great conversation with Reed. I'm encouraged that we're looking at how do we continue to research something that is a revenue source other than assessments, even though I reluctantly see that we have to use assessments at least in the beginning. And I'm wholeheartedly in agreement of that we don't say, well, that's done and move on. We need to have a commitment to continue to try and find something that doesn't have that unfairness while we move forward and go for the bond and go for the election and go for the necessary match. So I'm encouraged. I think staff has been receptive to the wide range of concerns brought by this wide-ranging group of stakeholders. So I think today has been an encouraging update. So thanks.
Appreciate all the help y'all are putting in. Okay. 9 minutes of freedom returned.
Unless anybody has any other questions, comments.
Thank you all for your hard work and time. I know you're putting a lot in.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
Have a good rest of your week.
Thank you, everybody.